The relentless power of a demon surges through Xiao, and he truly feels like an amazing character that will decimate everyone that stands in his way. There's a few things that set Xiao apart from everyone else in the game, and his mobility is the first thing that comes to mind, and one of the important talents he has at his disposal would be the elemental skill, which has few interesting things about it. First of all, you can easily use it for traversal, and closing gaps between your jumps is a very satisfying feeling whenever you're timing right, but once you have some enemies around, there is no aiming involved, and the dash he performs will choose one of the targets and automatically go through it and anyone else who gets in his way. But the thing that probably matters the most, if you're set on perfecting this technique, would be his second passive talent that provides additional damage for your next dash attack as long as you can do it within 7 seconds after getting the buff. And because you can stack it up to 3 times, if you can do this correctly, one of your elemental skill dashes will deal 45% increased damage, but it does require careful planning that will naturally grow on you once you play the character for longer periods of time. Just keep in mind he has 2 charges for his elemental skill, so using one after another will give the second dash 15% damage, but the timer will run out on the third dash and you will reset the stack. So it's best to wait at least 3 seconds before using up the second charge in order to maintain the damage buff. Of course, optimal play aside, zipping twice in a row is a fantastic feeling and one that's hard to shake off, especially with the amount of damage you can quickly produce without counting on the passive itself. Now when it comes to his burst, once you put on the mask of the demon, you jump higher, attacks are wider, and the damage itself gets infused with the animo element. And obviously, the most fun way to take advantage of this would be his plunge attacks, although even without fully relying on them, the damage output just from normal attacks on a single target is significant enough, but when you're up against a group of enemies, there's nothing better than to plunge those pests away. It's also interesting that his damage increases every few seconds while under the effect of his burst, and it reaches climax on the very last seconds of his demon form, where he attains up to 25% extra damage bonus, so keep this in mind if you ever get the idea to switch him out before the burst is over. On the flip side, he also keeps losing health, but thankfully, it scales with the current HP he has, so there is no flat damage, and during most of the gameplay, it never felt like something that you need to worry about. Finally, the way his normal attacks are designed, he can easily handle groups of enemies, since the swings cover a significant area around him, so even without the burst, he can handle small enemies without too much effort. In fact, if he has a shield on him, he can pretty much spam his charge attack without any interruption, and the damage multiplier on it is actually very strong. So in essence, Xiao's design is all about mobility and using it to dominate groups of enemies. His attacks are fast, hard-hitting, and his stylish delivery of damage feels very rewarding, and few key mechanics, like cycling your dashes to maintain the active damage buff and staying through the whole duration on his burst, are the small things to keep in mind before every single monster perishes in his way. Also, if you want to see an ongoing analysis of Xiao, make sure to follow us on Twitter, link in the description. You can't help but appreciate how fun it is to use Xiao in world exploration. Leaping onto buildings or dashing towards those hard-to-reach locations, he's definitely going to be an easy recommendation for anyone who wants to have a strong explorer on their team. And what's even better, his own passive talent reduces climbing stamina by 20%, which is pretty insane for places like Dragonspine or Mountains of Liyue, and this will hopefully reduce the amount of dreadful energy you need to spend in order to grab those violet grass flowers. Now on the more serious side of things, he's probably one of the most interesting characters to build a team together, or in other words, to build a team around him. And that's because of his selfish playstyle, paired together with a pretty expensive burst. He needs others to supply him with more energy, since his own 2 chargers of elemental skill produce on average 3 elemental orbs. And of course, the reason why he's selfish would be thanks to his burst, which will end the moment you switch him out, so you need to remain on the battlefield, just like you would with Razor or Klee, in order to fully take advantage of his damage output, not to mention the fact his first passive rewards you the longer you keep using the burst. So when you're building a team, you definitely want someone that can produce abilities which linger on the battlefield, so someone like Xiangling or Xingqiu are great choices, while if you want to keep the elemental energy going, grabbing any of the animo characters can greatly fast track to Xiao's burst attacks, and it gets pretty ridiculous when you pair him together with someone like Venti or Sucrose, and then plunge into a neatly placed group of enemies. However, one thing to keep in mind would be the lack of support artifacts, since neither Archaic Petra nor Viridescent Venereer can help increase Xiao's damage output, because you can't crystallize or swirl the animo element itself, so it gets a little harder to boost his damage, and you need to rely on either your teammates or the few remaining artifacts like Noblesse Oblige. But on the bright side, there's only few enemies in the game which have high resistance to animo elements, and even better, most of the human enemies like Fatui Skirmishers or Sisson Mages have negative resistance to physical attacks. Moving over to equipment, probably the easiest and fastest way to build him would be by using a combination of the 2 set bonuses of Gladiators and Viridescent, so that you can end up with a nice damage boost in both animo and overall attack. And while looking at weapons, while Crescent Pike is a great weapon weapon to use for someone like Xiangling, it's a bit hard to recommend it for Xiao, since most of the time, you're trying to activate his burst as often as possible, and you're going to be missing out on all that physical damage boost you get from the substat, so it's better to go for any of the polearms that provide critical rating, damage, or even just attack percentage. Of course, it comes with no surprise that his signature weapon, the Primordial Jade Winged Spear, works insanely well on him, and the passive skill itself is very easy to achieve thanks to his playstyle. All in all, Xiao is going to be an insanely useful party member for when you're exploring the world, and while he demands a lot of your attention to fully utilize his burst, you can use a combination of various strong teammates to help fully utilize his devastating plunge attacks, and even without the gimmick, he has a very good damage output, and thanks to his alignment to the Anemo element, he can take care of most enemies without a hitch. There's not a lot of peaceful moments you will have with this guy, and the extreme ability he brings with his talents is unparalleled compared to any other character in the game. His swift delivery of attacks and wide area coverage makes it easy to deal with most groups of enemies, and you can even feel the intense hatred inside of him when you're taking care of those dandelions. Now of course, a lot of things said here are still subjective, and the most important thing to find out about him is to always give a visit to the trial run and test him out yourself just to see if you can appreciate his playstyle. It definitely transforms the experience into a more fast-paced combat, and sometimes even the field of view positioning gets a little weird if you use the dash skill when the enemy is behind you. And the one thing that sticks out about Xiao is the fact that he's the first dedicated main damage dealer for Anemo, and even if you would argue that you can use Sucrose, Venti, or basically any other character from this element as your main damage dealer, the fact of the matter is, Xiao doesn't provide support because the only way he can support the team is by wiping out your enemies. But without minding his playstyle, he is definitely a worthwhile consideration, especially for those who want to have a dedicated damage dealer for Anemo, not to mention it's one of the neutral elements when it comes to the elemental reactions and even enemy resistances. Overall, Xiao is an insanely rewarding and powerful Anemo damage dealer that knows how to end his enemies in a stylish manner, and thanks to his extreme mobility that comes from his elemental skill and burst, he can zip around very easily and even traverse locations in a fast-paced manner, not to mention he also makes climbing easier because of his passive talent. However, there are a few drawbacks, and the first one would be the inability to boost his damage with artifacts like Viridescent or Archaic Petra, which contributes a significant chunk of damage that is especially relevant for characters who rely on elemental damage, so building him gets a little bit more expensive than your usual damage dealer. And then there's also his selfish playstyle, which further forces you to keep using the burst till the very end because of his first passive talent. Still, Xiao is absolutely terrifying when it comes to his damage output, and his plunge attacks are going to remain a big selling point of Genshin Impact for a long time. But for now, all that matters is to make sure that Timmy's Birds gets to see Xiao's hatred. Producing these videos takes a lot of resources and effort, so if there's any mistakes included, make sure to check out the pinned comment below the video. Also, you can help us out by subscribing and clicking the bell notification on and gently pressing the like button. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, where all of Xiao's builds will be shared. And as always, thank you for your support and watching us.